So let me ask you guys a question. How much bio do you want? Because I've been on a pretty darn good run right now of very interesting people that I've covered recently. Sly Stone, James Brown. It's like a who's who of interesting bios from the 60s. But I will say that Nico is probably the most varied and interesting bio that I've covered, and I would dare say maybe even we've covered in general right now for the 60s. So I can give you lots of bio.
Yes, please give us
a little. So
I want medium bio, John. I want the Goldilocks bio.
I'll give you a medium bio. Okay, so I think when most people who are music fans think of Nico, they think of her work on the Velvet Underground's seminal album, Velvet Underground and Nico, in which she sang 4 songs. Yep. And that was her output in the 1960s was this album we're covering, Chelsea Girl, and Velvet Underground and Nico. And they were actually both released in 1967. So those are the two pieces. Nico would record a few more albums in the 70s, a little bit in the 80s, and she would die young in a biking accident. So Josh, make sure that you tell Emily in her bike safety classes that when you're driving into town to get your marijuana, that you make sure that you wear your helmet, because that was how she unfortunately perished.
Yeah, that's why you always wear a helmet.
That is why you always wear a helmet, yes. But Nico, much like in life, Nico was not one for rules, as we will find out quite a bit.
It's also why you drive to get your marijuana. You don't get on your bike to get your marijuana.
Or have someone deliver it to you.
When you imagine yourself as a bohemian in the tradition of bohemian artists of yore, which Nico did, you don't really drive anywhere, And so, all right, so where do we even start with Nico? I think the first thing to know about her is that Nico is as much known for being an iconic image in many different ways as she is as being a musician. And part of the reason for that is she was a model in her teens. She was 5'10", pale skin, very chiseled features, pretty much consistently viewed as beautiful in sort of an icy, detached way. Every word you can possibly use to talk about a woman in the context of art has been applied to her. When she was young, she was an ingenue to like Serge Gainsbourg and different French film artists. She was in a Fellini movie in 1960. A chanteuse. So for the Velvet Underground, Andy Warhol picked her to be the chanteuse for the Velvet Underground. The chanteuse basically being the female troubadour, so to speak, in front of a group. She was supposed to be the beauty behind the beast that were the Velvet Underground. She's often called a muse. Later in life, she takes on the role of being the self-actualized feminist. She is highly influential on the Gothic movement. So she was kind of a little bit of everything to everybody, while herself admitting that she was not a person to ever put out or have a deep understanding of who she was. She sort of viewed herself in the way that you would think of as an existentialist, living in the moment and living to the next moment. There are quite a few quotes, including one that I just put on Twitter earlier today. She lived in a different country for every decade of her life, and she lived 5 decades. And she had quite a life. So let me give you a little bit of the bullet points in terms of what it is. First of all, it is Nico and not Nico or Neko, as people will say. She was German. She was born in 1938 with the name Christa Pafkin. The name Nico comes from the photographer that discovered her, Herbert Tobias, was in love with a man named Nikos Papatakis, who actually was having an affair with Nico as a teenage model. And he decided to name her Nico in tribute to Papatakis, and it sticks for the entire rest of her life. Her father was in the SS, and we're not 100% sure what happens, but we know that he does die in the war. How he dies is never quite clear. She is widowed, or excuse me, not widowed. She is left fatherless young. Her father came from a pretty affluent background. Her mother came from a lower class background. And so Nico drops out of school at 13 and begins working in a department store, in which she's discovered as a model shortly afterwards.
Wait, I'm sorry. So did she not know how her dad died, or did she know but just never talked about it?
Nico was notorious for putting out a mythology around her persona. It was part of why Andy Warhol loved her so much. It was part of just what she was, right? That woman who was always detached. People described her as like a walking icicle or detached. She had that sort of detached sex appeal that was very appealing, especially to men in the arts. That was kind of her thing. She was as much, and I don't want to underestimate her musical output, but you cannot talk about her without talking about the image she projected, because so much of her career is in the context of image, whether it's as a model, an actress, why she was put in front of the Velvet Underground, and later, what she would sing about, including on this album. So, very long story short, modeling leads to acting. She actually studies under Lee Strasberg, who's known for the Strasberg method. Josh, I'm sure you could talk about that a little bit more, right?
Yes.
Yep. So, but she was classically trained in that sense. So she ends up in Fellini's La Dolce Vita, and she ends up in many other movies, including Andy Warhol's Chelsea Girls, in 1967, which this album, Chelsea Girl, which we're covering today, was conceived as sort of a companion piece for. She had a very highly publicized life in the 60s. If you were a man in the music world or in the art world of any standing, your orbit crossed with Nico, and most likely you also were her lover at some point or another. And I don't mean that negatively. But she would be the first. One of the reasons that Nico has gained a second appreciation in the modern context is for a certain type of sex-positive feminist, right? Nico is looked at as ahead of her times because she was unabashedly sexual, but sort of kind of the view was on her own terms. Unfortunately, she later in life sort of credited some of this detachment in her sexuality to the fact that she was raped by a serviceman, a U.S. serviceman at age 15. Which she said and afterwards became highly sexualized in the modeling world. So those combination of those two things, when it was not, let's be honest, in the mid to late 60s into the early 70s, it was the worst kept secret in the world was that most of the groupies around rock bands were between the ages of 13 and 18 years old. And, Nico was in that modeling world in that life, right? It also led to some interesting things. Her father was a member of the SS, so her views on Jews were always complicated. Some would say anti-Semitic, others would say she had her moments. Her views on black Americans in particular were complicated. The man who raped her was a black American serviceman, which is where she attributes some of that loathing to, but she had a pretty long and controversial series of public statements about black men in particular in the 70s, which led to sort of her becoming a pariah for a while in the 70s. But at different times, she's spending time with Jim Morrison. She's in the Velvet Underground, and she has a romantic relationship with each member of the Velvet Underground.
That must have been awkward.
It was, and it did not end well for the Velvet Underground because of that. In fact, much of why the Velvet Underground were a quick crash and burn is attributed to her and her complex relationship with Lou Reed in particular.
She was their Yoko.
But yes, she was more like an Anita Pallenberg for the Stones than she was a Yoko, Matt, if that makes sense.
I don't know who that is.
That is the woman who was, and ironically enough, Nico's great love was Brian Jones of the Stones, but where Anita Pallenberg comes in is that Anita Pallenberg was married to Brian Jones and left him for Keith Richards while both were in the Stones, which was attributed to his
I didn't know that
breakdown. Yes. So not to get gossip pagey, but part of what Nico was in the 60s and 70s was the idea that she was around all of these creative men. She was a muse for so many men. Her songs were mostly written by men from sort of a woman singing about a male perspective idea. So it may be unpopular to say, but that's a large part of who she is, the sex appeal. And in that sense, she's very much like a lot of male artists that were highly sexualized in the 60s, right? Mick Jagger, Robert Plant, Iggy Pop, all of whom she had relationships with. Notably, also, she at the time she was recording this album, and this does tie in, so not to continue to harp on that, but the lead guitarist on this album was Jackson Browne, who was her lover at the time of recording this album, a young Jackson Browne. So when you hear the guitar on this album, it's Jackson Browne playing it. I mean, I can keep going. She played in a band while she was in the Velvet Underground that had members of the Velvet Underground, Jackson Browne, Tim Buckley, a whole bunch of famous blues musicians. The shows were considered to be pretty brutal because Nico was sort of finding her way, I think, as a singer. And then she spends time with Jim Morrison while he was on a break.
Yeah,
and during that time, they do a ton of drugs, and he encourages her to write her own stuff. And so half of this album is her writing her own stuff, and half of it is the Velvet Underground writing stuff for her. And actually, Bob Dylan wrote a song for her on this album too that was originally conceived in 1964, ironically enough, because the album we talked about today was there when she was apparently vacationing with Bob Dylan, and it was largely thought that she had a brief fling with him that the song was about. So that's Nico. In terms of the notes on the album, it was released in October 1967, and you won't believe who it's produced by, guys. Tom Wilson. Good old Tom Wilson.
Goodness.
Yep, another Tom Wilson album.
That guy must be raking in with the royalties. Holy crap.
I know. He was like Carole King as a songwriter, as a producer, right? So she wrote most of the songs on this album, but 4 of them were written by various combinations of the Velvet Underground. For those that don't know the Velvet Underground, the primary songwriters were Lou Reed and John Cale. And then I'll Keep It With Mine is a Bob Dylan song that he gave to her as a gift. Why he gave it to her as a gift, you can probably figure it out. It is considered to be in the genre of chamber folk and 1960s pop. It notably does not have drums or bass, but has strings and flutes and a keyboard, which is normally played by either a member of the Velvet Underground who was in the studio or Jackson Browne, as well as one guitar that was played by either a member of the Velvet Underground or Jackson Browne as well. Nico notoriously did not like this album because she asked for drums and they did not provide it. She asked for a minimal production, and then she got a ton of strings. And what she hated more than anything was flutes, which there are tons of flutes on, and she hated them. So
was the Jethro Tull guy playing on this? The Aqualung guy? Did he get laid too?
No, but she notoriously and very publicly said that she hated this album because it didn't have drums. The guitars were not as aggressive as she would have wanted it, and there were just too many damn flutes, was basically her quote. And so with that being said, this was an album that in its time was considered to be, I guess, what we would call an indie darling now, and has now grown into sort of a seminal work of the 60s, especially amongst female singer-songwriters. You can tie her into the goth movement because of the fact that so many of them were large fans of her. Bauhaus, The Cure, Susie and the Banshees. Basically everybody who's anybody in goth rock was a Peter Murphy, who was in Bauhaus. All of them were big fans of her. So that is a little bit of the background on this album. I apologize for going so long, but you really can't think of Nico without thinking as like Andy Warhol's muse in music. Yeah. And also basically her being the commercial product at the front of the Velvet Underground on their most well-known album, which is also one of the most one of the albums that influenced the most amount of musicians, especially in the 70s and 80s, and actually all the way into the 2000s with bands like The Strokes. So, all right, I'm going to shut up for a while. Matt, what'd you think of this album?
All right, so if I had any interest in trying to garnish some cred with the hipster crowd, I would tell you how moving and brilliant this album is. But that's not the case, and I'm just going to tell you how I really feel, and that's that this album sucked. Oh. I did not like this album at all. This was not... This was... Okay, the few positive things. I liked the guitar, like the production with the guitar. Whatever they had, which was pretty much the same thing, I think, throughout the entire record. Whatever I don't know, lever they had on the
keyboard,
amp.
strings, flutes, guitar.
But it was the guitar mostly that I'm talking about, like the finger picking guitar, something like that you hear mostly throughout something like These Days. I did like that. The strings in and of themselves didn't bother me.
That would be Jackson Browne, by the way, playing those guitar parts. Just for FYI for you.
Yeah. So my biggest issue is her voice. It's awful. It was plodding. It was uninspiring. It was just boring, and it just wasn't. There's not much. The melody here is not very. It's very sparse. The songs that I disliked the most were the Velvet Underground songs, the John Cale, Lou Reed songs. The ones that I thought, this one's okay. It's not too bad. Were the Jackson Browne and Bob Dylan songs, and I didn't realize that till afterwards. But this was just a very. As I was listening to it, as it went on, it just got more and more difficult to listen to, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm missing here, and I think it's mainly her voice, which is just, it's like she's strung out on heroin, and she's just like, it's very boring to me. I did not like this at all.
Gotcha. And interestingly enough, before we go to Josh, Nico did struggle with heroin for most of her life, but she says she did not pick up that habit until 1973, and she was actually completely clean from heroin during the entire 60s and early 70s.
Well, maybe she got a little osmosis from the Velvet Underground or something here, because I'm hearing a lot of that in 1967.
Yep. Okay, Josh, what do you think?
Overall, I did not like this album either. I did like some of the songs on it, but my main gripe is the same as Matt's, and that her voice was too droning, and there wasn't really a lot of range in it, and it didn't even sound like she was singing some of the times. It was like she was like talking, and that was the main detraction on this album for me. I tended to actually like the arrangements and the music in the background, and I did like the violins. There is a lot of flute on here. I could leave that with the Renaissance Fair stuff, but overall I found that I didn't like some of the songs. I think the best song on this album is These Days, and I like that because it's in the Royal Tenenbaums movie, and
he loves her, by the way. Just FYI,
Wes Anderson?
It's one of his favorite musicians. Yes.
Yeah, I could see that. She's got that appeal for him. And
did he sleep with her?
No.
When he was 12?
If he had been around, he would have. Let's put it that way. But he was too late, unfortunately, to that party.
I liked It Was a Pleasure Then as well, that song, and Wrap Your Troubles in Dreams. I think those are the highlights for me. I really did not like Winter Song, and the song that sounded, I think it was, what song is it? Maybe Somewhere There's a Feather. I'm not sure if I like that song. But yeah, it's hard. It almost seems like, John, based on what you said, that like she didn't even really want to make this album, or at least it didn't turn out the way she wanted.
It tied into like
by all these people.
It tied into like her detached personality, right? Yeah. It's kind of like, did she want to make it? Did she not want to make it? Did she care how it was received? Did she not? That was kind of the essence of Nico, right? She was everything and nothing at the same time, and that's I think what the appeal is for folks.
Yeah, if she's the first detached hipster, then it didn't help on this album.
She was a scene. So this like. Let me start by saying I detested this album. Like, I really hated it. It's probably my least favorite album we've listened to. It's remarkably disappointing, though, because the lyrics to this album are fan-freaking-tastic. It's like almost a 10 of 10 in terms of the lyrics and the songs themselves. And so I'm listening to these great songs, and they really are. They're tremendous songs, because it's just, there's all of these great songwriters. As Matt mentioned, there's Bob Dylan, there's Jackson Browne, there's the members of the Velvet Underground. I mean, all these people can write songs, and they all clearly were inspired by her or stuff around her. So you're reading the lyrics, you're hearing these lyrics, and they're great. But then you get the same boring, monotonous arrangement over and over again with these heavy-handed strings and the flute, and there's no rhythm section at all. There's no drum, there's no bass, there's no rhythm guitar, nothing. And so it's this, it's somehow both a sparse arrangement musically, but also overindulgent in terms of overpowering what's going on. I think the idea is that you then put Nico's flat voice to balance it, but as Josh and Matt have both said, there's no variation of the voice. It's not a particularly pleasing voice to begin with. It's not an expressive voice like, say,
definitely
people that she influenced, like Bjork or I'm trying to think of just different people. Like there's Bjork, has that quirky voice, but there's a lot of emotion, and even like Patti Smith, there's more there. This is just sort of like a flatline voice underneath it, and all I could think is, God, if you put these songs in the hands of like PJ Harvey or somebody, they'd be just incredible freaking songs if somebody plugged in a guitar and you had these even like Suzanne Vega, if you want to go in a different direction, if you wanted, or Kate Bush, you wanted somebody who did a little bit more with it. These songs were just so wasted on the arrangements, and they were so wasted on the flatness of the voice. And so I think the reason I really hated this album was because it had the potential to be what people say it is, this seminal work, but it was the wrong person with the wrong thing. I just think you had to be there to get what Nico's appeal was, because standing, 35 years later, where there's been a whole evolution of empowered women and we've heard different sounds and stuff, I can imagine at the time there was no one who was who she was, because there wasn't. But now we've had people that have taken on that persona, whether it be in pop music, like a Madonna, in modern times, a Lady Gaga, and then in rock, there were people that took on the persona of empowered women or detached women, but kind of did the act better. So I guess I give her credit for being first, but and I could definitely see where it's influential, especially to artists, because it stretches the bounds, but oof. This was not and also the at the risk of sounding somewhat nativist, the German accent to some of these songs just does not do it any favors. It makes it harder to hear the lyrics while she's also singing as directly as possible. So you'd want the songs to be direct and they're being sung direct, but they're being sung direct but with a German accent that's not making it easy to access the words at times. So it even takes away from the directness of the singing. So it would almost be better if she had sung the songs in German, to be quite honest.
I just wonder if like the production is trying to like cover up the fact that she can't really sing that well.
But how is that happening? It's very easy to tell she can't sing. There's nothing covering that up. It's right out in front of you.
I think it's designed like how the Velvet Underground. It was designed though to be a contrast, right? Just like the beauty of Nico in front of like the sleaziness of the Velvet Underground, as Andy Warhol saw it. This was supposed to be these sweeping strings and flutes. And later she'd play the harmonium, for a similar kind of effect. Not on this album, but on other ones. That's kind of what she became known for. But I think it was designed to be a contrast, right? Her sort of voice colliding with these lush landscapes. And I get what you're going for, but it just did not work for me in any way. Yeah,
I would say too that this kind of going back to what we were talking about, what you were saying about Dylan, Josh, is that like the run of the songs, like the sound, it might be okay here or there, and I think maybe like with the first two tracks in particular, they might be the ones that I enjoyed the most, and I was like, okay, I'm not in love with them. I did know These Days from the Royal Tenenbaums as well, so it weren't too bad, but just as it went on, it got worse. And by the time you got to, like, it was a pleasure then. I was thinking, this has got some kind of weird, there was a little bit of a distorted guitar and a little bit more of an avant-garde thing going on in there. I'm like, all right, this might be, maybe they'll bust something out here. And of course they don't. And it just kind of, those sounds kind of hang and they kind of come in and out. And then by the time you get to Chelsea Girls, which is these two long songs, 8 minutes, 7 minutes long, and it's just... It's that
They're
song. Chelsea
great
Girls.
lyrically, though. They're
I don't
great
care.
lyrically.
I don't care. Great. That's awesome. But if I'm listening to a piece of music and when I hear a song for the first time, like Chelsea Girls, and it sticks in my head afterwards for so long,
does.
and it's so uninvited. I did not want that in there, and it was in there for so long. And I'm like, it's terrible. Oh.
It's funny because as you're saying that, because it's repetitive and it keeps going back into the same chorus. So like in my head, like all I could hear is like dun, 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 dun. So you've got that sort of like
Chelsea
string, like,
girl,
Chelsea girl,
shoot
it's
me
like
now.
that. Yeah, and it's like it is haunting, but in none of the ways you want a song to be haunting, and so.
Is she even trying? It's like that's the thing. It doesn't even seem like she's trying. Why am I here?
That's what I think people always try to. And I, like I said, all I can think about is if you give it to somebody like Robert Smith, these songs, and it's like, wow, they'd be fantastic and expressive. I know Morrissey loves Nico. I thought about like what it would be like for him singing some of these, and it would be way better. Like especially. Little Sister sounds like it's a song Morrissey would have written as a solo artist. And like I said, or you could plug it in and like, God, it's like when I hear a song like Winter Song, it's like all it would have taken was PJ Harvey with this song and she would have just destroyed this song and it would have been awesome. But instead it's, like you guys said, it's like, can we go back? It's like these lyrics are wasted. It just really frustrated me. So
but if you see the reviews, there's like terms like it's brilliant, it's a masterpiece, it's getting like 5 stars and 9 stars. It's like, what are we missing? Like what is going on here? Because
it's what Nico was. It's the whole package, Matt. You know what I mean? That's what it is. Because it's what she represented in the era that she represented it. And on top of it, throw her into the general mythology of the Velvet Underground. And we've talked about that quote that was made about the Velvet Underground only sold so many albums, but they all went 30,000 albums, I think the quote was, but they went on to all start a band, and that's what it was. And you throw in Andy Warhol, you throw in the fact that look at how much people love celebrity lives now and celebrity sex lives, and in a certain corner of the music press and the hipster era, like Nico was the ultimate it girl, right? She could have any man she wanted, but you couldn't know her. She was always interesting. Yeah, she was like a visual piece of art in some ways.
Well, can you imagine what the response would have been like had this been like a really good record with all that other stuff? There would have been like a supernova or something like that.
But it wouldn't have been. But it wouldn't have been what this is, because the whole idea of why she's Nico is because you read an album like this. If it becomes a huge hit, you don't have that.
Not even a huge hit, but just like, I don't know. I get all the mystique and everything like that.
Are the Velvet Underground without being sort of that you don't know what they are in
but
their
at least
time,
I've heard some Velvet Underground stuff, and I'm like, that's cool. Like that's, and that's what I'm saying here. I just find that mystique and all that stuff that you're talking about with her, John, in terms of, how her effect on people and this aura and the muse and all that stuff, it just speaks to how powerful that must have really been, like on some different level, because at least people like Madonna, Lady Gaga, other people that have like, I don't know, any type of mystique around them. There's music that are like, okay, I get why people would like this. Even if it's not your thing, it's like, I understand why they would like that. Like, even with somebody, PJ Harvey, who's a little bit more of an avant-garde, kind of harder, she's not like a pop figure, or Bjork, it's like, okay, there's interesting stuff going on here. Some of it might be catchy, some of it's groundbreaking. This is just boring and plodding, and I don't know where the enjoyment comes from. Lyrically, maybe, but if it's a piece of music, you got to have the music there, don't you?
I agree, and that's why I was so frustrated, because it, unlike you said, unlike the Velvet Underground, where you don't always love everything, but you can appreciate it. It's the opposite of that Captain Beefheart album that had all the variety that we talked about. This is just one note over and over again at different lengths. And that's why I spent so much time on the bio, because to understand the influence, you have to understand the whole package of what Nico is. And you mentioned Madonna. The question is, like, if you're Madonna is Madonna because of the image and the effect, but she also was Madonna because of the songs, right, of the time. This is sort of like if you were someone of the image, but maybe without the songs in their context. But like I said,
Yeah,
It's not the song's problems. These songs, the lyrics are fantastic. It's just everything else around it is just miserable.
She reminds me a little bit of like a Lana Del Rey too.
Yes.
And I think for me, like, just to wrap up my final thoughts, I think what John said about there being no emotion in her voice, that hit the nail on the head for me, and that droning aspect that Matt said too. The voice was complete wash and kind of ruined the record. So
yeah, I think that maybe you're right, John. Maybe if this was in hands of other people, other artists, producers, whatever, that maybe it would be a different thing. But I couldn't I maybe listened to it 3 times, and my wife's like, I can't believe you got through that 3 times. You're doing way too much for this podcast. But I just came away. It was the clear answer for me. It's the voice, much more so than anything else, was really what did it in. And then I think it could have been better for sure. It couldn't have been worse.
Yeah,
I would also say that one of the things I wanted to do was see the tribute album that was put out to Nico from all the people who were influenced by her, many of whom I liked, and it only reinforced that there was the ability for these songs to be great songs, because in the hands of other folks, they were remarkable. But
wait, was the tribute album this record, or is just a compilation?
Oh no, this was post death.
No, I understand that, but you're saying, but what was it? Just was the tribute album for this particular record?
It was all of her work, but
all of her
songs
work
from this were on it. But it only reinforced to me that in different hands these songs would have been there. But this is like listening to a spoken word album just with a female voice would be a way that I would describe this as well for people listening. I wouldn't recommend it. It's going to be a hard listen for most folks listening, and then I don't even really know who would be the target audience even amongst folks that might be receptive to her narrative.
Sad goth girls, maybe.
Or hipsters. Get on this, hipsters. This is all you.
But it's just funny because like I could give you 5 or 6 other recommendations of people who are influenced by her that are far enough back that you might as well start there and just skip ahead. So, I don't mean to continue to pile on, but yeah, this one, when I made my list of albums of the 60s, this is dead last on the list. So, yep. But unfortunately, after all of that, I wish I could say that things worked out well for Nico, but there is a consistent thread, and I'll end with this, of throughout the 70s, she becomes involved with a French director, gets addicted to heroin, sort of lives a bohemian lifestyle, has a very interesting relationship with her son, who she was quite the parent for her son, including introducing him to heroin, living with him her entire life until his death. There was a little bit of a codependency deal there. Not incest, but like codependency type deal. At one point, Nico's sort of neglecting herself so much that there's a belief that she is pretty much trying to destroy her notorious beauty. And in the 80s, she looks like a very different person, albeit with the same refined features. And she herself mentions that it was part of a self-destructive streak. And as we talked about before, she did die young. So
her son died before her?
No. Her son did not. Okay. She died young. But she is well regarded and well loved by a veritable who's who of people, many of whom overlap with the Velvet Underground as well. And so if you were a music historian or want to be one, it's certainly worth listening to, so you can say you listened to it. But I cannot recommend this. So.
We didn't mention the album cover either, because her face on the album cover pretty much says it all. It's like that's how I looked after I listened to the record, I think.
And you know me, like I have nothing against, icy detached women who are sexy and tall, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of a demo for me, right? And so I would have thought that it would have been more. I love female singer-songwriters more than I do males. I love sort of angsty, difficult women,
that's
women in terms of
that's
lyrics.
your holy grail, John.
It's like I was going to say, it should be my thing, but I can't lie, it was not. You know what I mean? And all I could think of was, God, if this was put in the hands of the people that I liked, then they would have had a field day with.
I think John's just mad that he wasn't around in the '60s, so he could have slept with Nico too.
If I was in the art world, I probably would have been drawn into her spider webs, and I'd probably be talking about how wonderful she was right now. But because she seemed to have that effect on everybody, it's pretty.
She had
amazing.
the Kavorka.
She is, and I don't mean to scandalize that, but men who know of women are very enamored by her. You know what I mean? And it's not like she was their only outlet, correct? And she wasn't dating these people or the love of their lives either, but they were taken in. I will leave with this. If you Google the words Nico, Iggy Pop, and oral sex, be prepared for a good 30 minutes of laughter, because it is quite a story, which I will not be telling on the podcast, but it is well worth checking out, because Iggy Pop is a wonderful storyteller, and that is amongst the funniest stories I've ever heard Iggy Pop tell. So there you go. That is going to be how I leave this segment and the show right
Leave
there.
them wanting more.
Cliffhanger.
Yes, and let's just say that after Nico was done with Iggy Pop, he was not leaving others wanting more, and we'll just say that.